Hi, and welcome to Dipping and Out with Lucy, the podcast that opens up the discussion around domestic abuse. I am very fortunate this afternoon to be sitting down with Catherine Haworth. I've been very lucky also to have met Catherine in person recently, and we managed to, I managed to mess up trying to do a little snippet for something we were doing as a bonus episode for Pegs. The audio didn't work. So anyway, we've managed to get in a full episode, which I think will be phenomenal anyway. So we'll be fine. But Catherine is an award-winning DA and Children Act solicitor. She's an advocate, and she's also founder and owner of Haworth, even get it right, Lucy, Solicitors Family Law. So good afternoon, Catherine.
Hi, good afternoon. I was thinking, is it afternoon, morning? It is afternoon. That's how quickly time's gone. But yes, good afternoon.
Good afternoon, and thank you for being with us. And as I say, we've met in person. We tried, but my technology failed. And we'd had the annoying thing about that was we'd had such a good chat, even though it was like a little snippet of a few minutes.
Yeah.
We covered so much, and I just found myself with you nodding, going, "Yeah, yeah, yeah." So having a full episode, I know will make a massive difference to people to be able to hear kind of your expertise,
Mhm.
where you're coming from, what your kind of vision is of how you want to see things in the future and the work that you're doing. And so could you tell us a little bit about how you started on the journey you are now on?
Of course, yes. So I actually started my journey in conveyancing for my sins. And I did that for quite a few years. And then I had my first son. And I sort of thought, I'm not really doing anything that I love here. I'm not doing something that I'm really passionate about. And that was really important to me. Whilst I was working as a conveyancer, I volunteered for West Mercia Women's Aid, who's my local women's aid, and I volunteered with them, helping with the Freedom Programme, Power to Change, and group work predominantly in that section. So I decided to take the leap and work for them when a job came up. And the first position I had with them was the family court IDFA role. So that was doing family court support, but in the role of an IDFA. So doing the dash risk assessments, referring to Marek where needed, and doing a lot of injunctive work. I couldn't advocate for clients in court, but despite having a practicing certificate, simply because the rules and regulations don't allow you to. And so yeah, I did that, and then I did a little bit of hospital IDFA work and some high risk IDFA work as well. So that was sort of my area, and I did that for a short while, and then decided that I would become a solicitor in family law, dealing specifically with domestic abuse cases, as I really saw that there was such a struggle for people going through the family court system and a proper understanding in the family courts of domestic abuse and what that looked like, not just for victims, but for children who obviously are now recognised as victims in their own right.
Yeah.
So I decided to go and sort of pursue that journey. And yeah, I was working for a practice until very recently, where I decided to go self-employed, which is what I do now. So I run Haworth Family Law on the one part, which is probably about half of my time doing that. And that is purely pro bono, completely free legal advice. I don't get funding for it. I fund it all myself. And anybody who's a victim can sort of go onto the website and make an inquiry for free advice. And then the other half of my time, I consult for a firm called Avon and Somerset Family Law currently. So yeah, I consult for them, really lovely people, and that's sort of what brings up my paid work. And they do legal aid as well. So predominantly my paid work is legal aid.
That's amazing, and how important that work is. And as many people who will be listening will know, and I always seem to find when I look at the stats of episodes I do around the family court, they definitely get a lot of interest because it is. I think the only word I can think of that comes to the top of the head is a minefield. It is like literally a minefield of trying to navigate, and especially if you've never been through the family court, and if you're just starting out, and maybe it's the very beginning for you, and you listen to this,
Mhm.
hopefully it will give you some hope, because a lot's changed recently. We've had lots of changes going on, but hopefully it's going to take time, as we know, but things are slowly starting to move in. And like anything in life, it's been like this for a long time now, and it's going to take time. It's not going to happen overnight that things are going to change, but the work that you're doing and the fact that you're doing pro bono, that always screams to me that someone's doing it for the love of what they do. And like you said, it's finding what your passion is. And knowing that, and the reason obviously I started the podcast was what if somebody was out there and they didn't know where to turn and they didn't necessarily want to pick up the phone and they were a bit concerned about finding out any more. This is like a gentle way of approaching it and hopefully getting some advice that you would be seeking anyway. So I love this
Yeah.
idea of, we're all trying to get into that space, and you do need funding, by the way. I totally think you need funding.
I
So
think we all
just going to
do.
put that out there. You do. Yeah, we all need more.
Yeah.
But yeah, it's the fact that there are so many people who, and very often you do find that victims and survivors tend to be the litigant in person, don't they? And it's
Oh,
very
yeah.
often the perpetrator who is the one with the money being able to hire the big fancy barristers and solicitors. And from
Mhm.
your own work and what I've seen you put on LinkedIn, and it's amazing, is you totally get it and you see how the other side are playing things, and it's just so refreshing because so many solicitors, I think a lot of people are very put off because they think they don't understand, they don't get it, and you really do. And so when you're
Mhm.
speaking to people, how do you kind of approach that conversation when they come to you through the pro bono clinic?
I think one of the first things I do is just allow them to feel heard. So I always sort of say, tell me your story. And it's up to them. Some people don't want to tell me their full story because they're tired of telling the
Yes.
story. Others really want you to hear everything that they feel is unheard. And so I always feel that hearing them in the first instance is the most important. And it also gives me a lot of context about their mental state, where they've come from, what expectations they had of the family court, and where they're at now. And I always caveat with my advice with, I get it, like I get domestic abuse. My advice is going to tell you what a family court are going to do with that. And I think that's the hardest part of my role, is that I quite often will give advice which it's sort of like I'm hearing what you're saying, but from a legal perspective, in the confines of the law and the family court, this is likely going to be your outcome. And sometimes the two don't always match. And I think it can be really hard to deliver that advice to people when they're sort of at their last hope, so to speak. And I think personally, one of the issues I find with the family court in general, and this isn't to like massively criticize anybody in particular, but then when we're assessing the risk for a child, so this is what we're doing in family court, we're assessing the risk for the child really, and where the safest place for them to be is and what good contact looks like. Quite often your victim survivor is going to present with some form of mental health trauma. And I would be surprised if they didn't, given what they've been through. It would be very surprising if you had a victim survivor who hadn't presented some form of, or unless they've been through some therapy already, which is often helpful. And I find that they come, and then obviously perpetrators are naturally charming, naturally the exact person that you fell for in the first place. They're sort of charming the courts, charming the professionals. And you've almost got this dynamic being formed of, well, hold on, we've got sort of the victim survivor who's at times erratic because that's how they're expressing their trauma.
Yes.
And your perpetrator who's so level and so composed. And this is what the family courts see. This is what the professionals see. And what they're not seeing is, well, hold on. And this is where I think the family court needs to do better. Questioning and being inquisitive. Okay, so why is that your response to the victim survivor? Like, what is it that's triggering that response? And really looking into, how can we help you, victim survivor, overcome that trauma? Because the difficulty is, I tend to find that they just want to almost in their reports have a quick fix, like well, mum needs to work on her mental health, or dad needs to work on his mental health, and then a perpetrator parent is safe for now. And this is when I see transfers of residency in particular. There's big trauma for the victim that's manifesting itself, and I'm not saying that that's not harmful to the child, because sometimes it is, and I'm not saying it's not. But when you look at the balance of harm overall, you're effectively saying, well, hold on a minute, we're going to put the victim with the person who made you like that.
Yes.
Because you're like that.
Yeah.
And it's so hard, because it's like, you just think, what? Because what they aren't thinking about is right now, whilst the victim's healing, the child might be exposed to that sort of short-term harm. And I get that that's really tough for family court, but you've just placed them with the perpetrator who caused that. So that long-term harm to that child is now significant because you've placed the child in that person's care. And what the victim is telling you is that that person is controlling, that person is psychologically abusive and has made them have this trauma. And I
Mm.
think there's so little acknowledgement of, well, how can we help the victim? How can we help the victim get to a better mental state, to a position where they can parent their child without consequences being put onto the child, as
Yeah.
opposed to, oh, well, let's just put the child with the unsafe parent, because that seems the most quick and easy thing to do, right? And that's sort of the pattern I'm seeing at the moment. And it can be extremely hard to navigate because I see that, but a lot of family court professionals, despite the fact that so many cases coming to family court have allegations of domestic abuse, they
Yeah.
don't see it. And it's really difficult. And I wish that there was a bigger focus on providing support for the victim
Yeah.
as opposed to blaming them for the reason that their child needs to be transferred to the other parent. And I feel like
Mm.
it is a broken system. And I see that so often. And it's absolutely devastating when it happens because you know at that point it's very hard to get back.
Yeah, honestly, you've summed it up brilliantly there, and you've covered so many points. And that is, I know in my bones, so many people will be going, "Oh my God, yes," and not even just the victim survivors, their families as well, who have to watch, parents who are watching their children go through this. I say children, they're adults, but they're still their
Yeah.
children going through it, watching their grandchildren go through it. And like you say, it gets to that point where, and one of the things I was thinking, you've just hit on it there with, the courts don't see it, is they miss so much, so they don't see what goes on in the discussion room. The magistrates, those judges, they don't see how the manipulations are played out. Like you say, of course a victim is going to present as somebody who seems very frustrated, very agitated. Yes, because they're being made to sit in the same room, potentially, if it's not been agreed that they can have separate discussion rooms, etc. They're being put in the same room as the perpetrator of the very person that has caused this
Mhm.
trauma in the first place, and is loving every minute of it, thinking this is great. This is just another way for me to, to act out the circus of it all for them.
Mhm.
And all those things that go on, and I've known this with victims and survivors, even just getting into the lift at family court, having to time that for themselves with, if they're going with a Mackenzie friend, having to explain to them, saying, well, I'm scared I'm going to end up in the same lift because they're going to really intimidate me, etc.
Yeah.
It's all those things they don't see. And I think that's
Mhm.
why there should be so much more training for the courts. There should be so much more understanding of how it all plays out behind the scenes, because even though that's in plain sight, if you like, but not in front of them. So it's all
Yeah.
very, like you say, the perpetrator's very charming. And for the child then to see them perpetuating that trauma by putting the
Mhm.
child in the very situation that's created for the victim survivor parent. Yeah, and it's an ongoing
Mhm.
cycle, and that's, like you say, it's a huge problem. And it's either, I always think it's they don't want to see it. I think they think it's far too difficult because so many cases, like you've just said, have alleged abuse. And if we start looking at every single one, well, yeah, but how many children would you be saving them from all this heartache and all this harm that's coming to them? And you're right, it's such a difficult situation. But if there are
Mhm.
some, I always think there's some kind of, I know the term red flag gets used a lot, so it sometimes irritates me. But anyway, the red flags, if you like,
Yeah.
of, for example, you might have one parent who's the victim parent who does the separated parenting program, because usually that would be the first thing that the courts would suggest, because they see it as conflict, whereas actually it's not conflict between parents, it's a perpetrator and a victim. And it's
Oh
as
my God,
simple.
don't get me started on separated. I say that all the time. I'm just like, why are we doing a separated parents program and one's
Yeah,
perpetrator? Like, you need to do a freedom program and you need to do a DAP program. I'm
yeah,
sorry. A
yeah.
separated parents.
Me
Oh,
separated
I'm so
parent.
glad you said that.
Honestly, it drives me up the
Yeah.
wall. And then you'll find that the victim survivor usually is the one, because they obey authority and because they've come to a point in their life where they've been so controlled, they will do it straight away. They won't back down
Yeah.
and say, I'm not, no, they'll do it. They'll say, I've got to
Mhm.
do it. Whereas the
Yeah.
perpetrator will go, I'm not being told what to do. And they'll dance around it for as long as they want. And that
Yeah.
right there, to me, is that not a clear indication of somebody not willing to actually do as the court suggests? I'm not going to do as you tell me. It's
Yeah.
so obvious. I mean, to those of us that know, it's very obvious, but throwing people into a separated parents, but that's not solving anything. Get the children
No.
support, get support for the individual that's going through all of it. It's just,
Mm.
it drives me up the wall. But like, this is something that's gone on for so long. That's kind of their go-to. This is how it's been, so that's what we're going to do. That's our first step. And like you say, it's always meant to be about where the contact should take place in terms of how often, etc. But again, it seems it's always been this idea around, well, a parent, both parents have a right to a relationship with a child. I totally agree with that. As long as both parents are safe parents.
Yeah.
If
Yeah.
they're not, then you don't have right to anything.
I know. And I think that ties in beautifully with the sort of the change that they've just announced about the change in presumption of contact. And I think that deserves a little clap on its
Yes.
own. Just to get that through is absolutely monumental. And honestly, well done to all of the team and Claire who led that. But behind that, as I said, like we've had agencies, and I don't want to sort of like name names, but sort of agencies involved in court in particular that give feedback on how to best deliver contact for the children. So all these agencies that feed into it have been trained now for years on how to promote contact safely between two parents, and not just trained to do that, but given the relevant research to back that. To say this is, this research shows that contact with both parents is more beneficial because of X, Y, and Z. So it's great that we've had the change, but now what we need to see is that change being applied. And we also need to see the research behind that change being taught in terms of this is why the change was made in situations of domestic abuse. And this is why that other research is now sort of superseded by this change. And I just feel that that's going to take a long time. So it's a great change, and it kind of gives us that momentum to start saying, right, okay, well, let's start challenging some of the decisions or recommendations in these reports. But it's going to take time. And yeah, for the agencies to really take that on board, that there is this change. And also, I think if you've been doing it for so long and you've been taught there's a certain way of doing it and why, if you were me, for example, I'd want to know the whys. I'd be like, well, why is this changed? Like, where's the research? Why is it better? So it's about teaching them why it's better and what that really means. And I think it's going to take a while to see that rolled out, but I'm hopeful that when it is, we'll see a much more positive outcome for victims. My only concern is, are perpetrators going to use that on the reverse? And I guess it's one to see, isn't it? But this is the problem with perpetrators. They'll twist anything. They will literally twist anything. Like we talk about Darvo, we talk about the deny, attack and reverse victim offender. That is something I see so much at the moment. And I think the family court report that came out earlier this year, which was commissioned by the DAC's office, said that Darvo was used more than PA, parental alienation, in terms of perpetrators' tactics. So they tended to say, well, actually, no, I'm the victim. I'm abused. I'm a victim of emotional abuse. And that's what we were seeing. And then you can sort of get two sets of allegations that are almost being tested at the fact find hearing. And then the victim is at risk of having findings made against them if their evidence isn't as strong. And sometimes their evidence naturally won't be as strong, because we know when you've been through trauma, your ability to recollect events, your ability to sort of give that verbal evidence in a court setting is diminished, because you can't piece it all together, because that's a normal trauma response.
Of course.
And it's so difficult to navigate as a victim. And even more so when you're a litigating person, I feel, because you don't have that support and guidance going through it.
That's so, again, 100% true. And I totally agree with you. It's a great start with the repeal of the presumption of contact, but it is just the start. And like you say, if agencies have been told this is the way it is for so long, but now we're going to flip it on its head, well, then they, like you say, they need the whys, the how's it's going to move forward. Otherwise, it's just words. It's just, we're not doing anything with it. And as you say, you're 100% right as well. Perpetrators will happily use this as a means of flipping it on its head. And we so often see it, don't we, in terms of victims and survivors, when the perpetrators say, like you said, they're crazy, they need psychologically assessing, they're bonkers, but this person has been subjected to coercive control, to psychological abuse for so long. I've known individuals who have thought that they were suffering with, and I'm talking about people in their mid-30s, with dementia, early onset dementia, because they're so convinced that the way their reality is, well, that can't be right because they said, well, don't you remember I said this? And because it's so convincing, these are people who are absolutely horrifically traumatized by something that is,
Mhm.
I call it the drip effect. So it's, when I always say to people, when we talk about abuse, it's not like you see in the films where it's all done in 2 hours, and then it's all terrible at the beginning, but it all works out in the end. That's not how it works. It's a
Mhm.
slow drip effect and it goes on for years. It goes on for a very, very long time. And if that was happening to you over and over again, and that was your normal, and then you're put into a setting where you're told, right, now you're going to have to fight for your children, even though you're the one more often than not is the safe parent, is the one that's been doing all the caring, etc., etc. But in that as well, I always feel so sorry for litigating in persons because they go in there believing, and I've seen this again when I used to work for my local charities, they go in there believing that the truth will out, the truth will set you free. And it's the most heartbreaking thing when you see actually, like you said at the
Mhm.
beginning, we're going back to what you said about, okay, I know that's your experience. However, I'm going to tell you this is how it's probably going to play out. And you're being realistic, and that's what people
Yeah.
need. And as hard as it is to hear, as frustrating as to go, yes, but that's not fair. No, it's not. But that's the way the system is at
Yeah.
the moment. And you need, and in fact, forewarned is forearmed. You're better off knowing what's coming. So then you can actually be, and I've watched victims and survivors further down the line, and because we know the courts, using the courts as a way of keeping that control, stalking and harassment by proxy, I think, as it's been called recently, and it is. It's a way of the
Yeah.
perpetrator keeping that control. But once the victim survivor sees all of that, they can start to actually be one step ahead of the perpetrator. Right, I know what they're going to do next. I've
Yeah.
lived with, I've said that to victims and survivors before. Actually, you're the best person placed to deal with this person. You know them better than anyone. You've lived with them for so long.
Mhm.
You know how they manipulate. You know what their next move's going to be. So actually, flip that on its head and say you know
Yeah.
exactly what their next tactic's going to be and be ready for it. As horrible as it is, it's like I think it's
Mhm.
like going into battle.
It is.
I know it sounds really
Mm.
dramatic to say that, but psychologically, it's a battle.
Yeah, and you do get to a point where you sort of you can recognize, even though they will always go, their moves are so unpredictable. You're walking on eggshells. There is predictability there.
Yeah,
When you step back and you do that work and you see it. And I will have calls now where I sort of, because I'm so used to it, I guess from the dash risk assessments that I've done, and also just from the work that I do, I'm like, right, okay, so is he threatened to kill himself? And they're like, yeah, as if to be like, I thought that was a massive thing. And I'm like, they all do it. And it sounds like I'm pretty sure there's like 90% in my cases, there will be a threat to kill themselves or like some sort of suicide
yeah.
ideation being
Oh,
posed by the
yeah,
perpetrator. And I'm so used to seeing it. And I think it's like they're sort of like, oh, that, I thought that was really unusual. And I'm like, it is. It's an unusual behavior, but
yeah.
not from a perpetrator. You get to learn those patterns. And I remember being told by law firms before, like you can't be an advert and a solicitor, the two don't mix. Now I say no to that. I say
Yeah.
you absolutely can. And I'm never going to take my id for training and my id for hat off because it is so important in safeguarding to have that knowledge and to have that understanding. So I give legal advice that is correct and I give legal advice that is helpful in a way that I hope is constructive and can
Yeah.
help navigate the family court system. But I'm quite resolution focused as well. So I don't necessarily agree with angry law tactics. I think family court is a horrible place for anybody to be. And if we can try and navigate that in a way which is less sort of, I know it's high conflict anyway, I hate that
Yeah.
term, but I know it is. But if we can navigate that in a way which everybody's sort of softened, then that's helpful. But I tend to find that my approach is much more wider than that. So I will have somebody come to me and I can give them that legal advice and tell them how I think the next hearing is going to go, how the case is going to go, the general procedures. But I'm also thinking about, right, okay, and this is what everybody needs to be doing. When I talk about family court, looking at what can we do to help? That
Yeah.
is always my question. Am I going to refer you for therapeutic support? Are you engaged with your domestic abuse agency? I've had one client come to me who she told me her story and she wasn't even registered with the domestic abuse agency and she was exceptionally high risk. So
Yeah.
straight to Marek, I went with her,
Yeah.
made a referral straight to Marek. And I'm doing these things alongside my solicitor work. And I have been criticised once for making a safeguarding referral for a child as a solicitor,
I mean,
basically that it's
wow.
not my
How
duty.
dare you protect a
I know.
child?
And I just thought, well, I don't care. Because ultimately, if I feel a child is at risk,
Yeah.
I don't care. My position as solicitor is irrelevant. A child at risk is a child at risk, and I will make a safeguarding referral, and that is the end of it.
Yeah.
Whether or not something comes of that referral is then out of my hands, and that is not up to me. But I've made the referral, and that's what's important. But yeah, I feel that the tactic I sort of adopt is very much that. It's very much how are we looking at safeguarding as a whole, and family court is just part of that for what I do. It's just a part of what I need to try and navigate for my clients. But I'm always thinking, like, what can we do to help the victim survivor, not just in family court, but in themselves, and like what do they need in terms of their support as well. And I think that's the most powerful thing that I would suggest anyone in the family court to look at doing is sort of like, what can I do outside of my role? Like, I'm not the one delivering IDFA support, and I'm not the one delivering counselling. I'm not a counsellor, but I know how to refer and where to refer them and when, and that's really important.
Yeah, definitely. And that's exactly what I think people need to understand as well, is as much as the whole experience of the family court is something that can go on for a very long time. Well, yes, but actually while all that's going on, your mental health is suffering, your day-to-day life is impacted, your relationship with your children potentially, there's so many things that are going on in the background, and I kind of call it spinning 50,000 plates. Someone's trying to do all these things while deal with all of that, and at some point you will hit burnout if you don't take that time to, like you say, we need professionals to go, okay, what does this person need for this child then to be in a position where they can have, we'd all like to have a normal life, but as normal as possible in the sense that, a childhood that they can remember and enjoy. And interestingly, I was talking to somebody the other day, and I'd said the difficulty for a lot of parents is, well, the time I have with my children, say for example Christmas coming up, we're now in November, and it may be that Christmas Day looks a bit different this year. It may be that you're celebrating it slightly later, slightly earlier. And what I try to say to people is, it's a date in a diary. I know it seems so unfair, but your child is not going to remember whether it was on the 24th, the 25th, the 26th that you celebrate. All they're going to remember is that love, those memories, all of that. And a perpetrator can't take that away from you. And it's like you say, once that support's there, they can start to see a better future, a better life, a happier life. And it takes all these people involved to help them see that. And I think, especially if you're involved with the family court, support is huge, not just for yourself, but for your children as well. And the children, and again, but I did some work with C.I.C when I worked for the charity, and looking at these children who are impacted, who very often are blaming themselves. They think it's their fault. A lot of children, in terms of divorce or separation, even if abuse isn't present, they blame themselves. They think they've done something wrong. And actually, it's trying to help those children see that no, you're not the problem, and you can love both parents, but you don't have to like bad behavior. You don't have to like the behavior that's displayed towards you. And it's so important that like I couldn't agree with you more, that link between the family court and support is everything. And it's not happening, and people are constantly falling through the cracks. And it's devastating.
It is, and I think I'm quite lucky in that I say lucky. I sit on quite a few domestic abuse advisory boards, so I sit on, and they sit underneath the local family justice board. So every region will have a local family justice board for family court things, and it's not all of them, but many. And I starting to have these domestic abuse support groups that sit underneath the main group, but feeds into them about best practice and things that can change. So I sit on the one in Avon and Somerset, and I also sit on the one in Herefordshire and Worcestershire, which is where I'm from. And the one in Avon and Somerset, it's been running slightly longer. But the first thing we did, under guidance of a local judge there, was put together a family court guide for victims of domestic abuse who were litigants in person navigating family court. The point of it is to go through all of the terminology. Are you eligible for legal aid? What the different roles of different people are, and what to expect through that journey. And I think we've had some people use that, and they've found it really helpful because it's really easy to read. So I put it together along with, I helped put it together, I should say, along with the judge who wrote the main of it, and then some other lawyers. And then it went to some people with lived experience who tore it all apart and was like, it doesn't make any sense. Completely delegalized it, but made it in a reader friendly format then. And yeah, honestly, the feedback's been incredible. So at the end of the guide, there's loads of resources which are very much tailored to Avon and Somerset. But the beauty of it is it can be rolled out in any local
Yes.
authority. You would just change the resources at the end. So I think we're looking at adopting it in Herefordshire and Worcestershire.
Amazing.
And I also sit on a domestic abuse board in Devon. Along with the other things that I do, I
Why
do
are you
this
doing
as
nothing else?
well.
Why do nothing else?
Yeah, and I'm hoping to raise it there at the next meetings. I think that actually having that, it's not perfect, and I'd much rather them have some form of legal advice and support, like all the way through, but it's something that they can use and rely on. Legal aid is effectively non-existent, really, isn't it? It's really difficult to get for the majority of people. And I say to everybody, like, I couldn't afford me and I wouldn't be eligible for legal aid. So I'm in the same boat as a lot of people, especially with the economy the way it is. And like you say, the perpetrators, I've had cases where perpetrators have stopped paying for the children's school clubs and school events, and sometimes their private schooling, to pay their solicitors. And you just think, how is that child focused? But they do, and it just is so strange. Well, it's not strange, we know it's a tactic, but it's just strange there's not more available for victim survivors to access that sort of legal support, and it's really, really difficult for them.
Yeah, it is. It is. And again, touching on that, and by the way, that's an incredible, and we all need a copy of that. Everybody should have a copy of that and be able to look at it and go, oh, okay, because it is that, the
Yeah.
terminology. I often think as well, if you've not done Latin GCSE or something, inter parte costs and all this, you're like, okay, let me
Oh
just go
yeah,
and Google. For a
I
lot of people,
know.
it's very intimidating, and
Yeah.
it's okay if you're in the know and you have that kind of legal background. But if you don't,
Mm-hmm.
and your Mackenzie friend isn't somebody who has a lot of legal knowledge, then you're really quite in a dangerous position, because I know
Yeah.
Mackenzie friends have a certain element, but they, again, for a lot of people who probably don't know, and obviously you're the expert, but litigant in person, they have to speak for themselves. Whereas
Yeah.
the applicant, usually, if it's the perpetrator, they have their barrister, their solicitor doing everything for them, and then everything
Yeah.
falls on that litigant in person who is trying to process everything else and deal with all this. So having
Mm.
something there that explains the whole kind of, and again, for many people, I was talking about this recently, if you've never been through the family court, you might think, okay, so I'm just going to go and it'll be dealt with. Actually, no, that's just your first hearing. We haven't even got
Yeah.
to contested, and that can happen again and again and again, and breaches of
Yeah.
the order, etc., etc., and it goes on and on and on. And trying to explain that to people, so that they have some understanding, they need to be able to go in and be slightly forewarned, because it's a very,
Yeah.
very difficult place to be in. Like you say, legal aid at the moment, we know it's very, very difficult. I hear of so few people who are able to access legal aid.
Mm-hmm.
And this is then adding to all the problems, and that links
Yes.
in with
Yeah.
how many cases are coming to family court that abuse is alleged. Probably, I don't know. I wouldn't like to guess actually at the percentage, but I would imagine it's very, very high. I can't
I think
imagine.
it's between 50 and 60. And the reason there's
Yeah.
no exact figure is because who is it? They tried to get it. This is like a on a tangent thing
Oh, I
now.
love it.
I looked into it and they tried to get the data, but there's something to do with that they wouldn't release the statistics of cases with alleged domestic abuse coming to family court. So that people have got an
Wow.
idea from the number of people, like polls that have been done to
Yeah.
say they've made allegations, but there's no exact knowledge of it. But it's estimated to be around 50 to 60%, but there's no recent research done into that. And I can't remember what I saw, but I saw something about it being that there's been a bar put on researching that particular piece of information,
Interest.
which I thought was
Very.
really
Oh,
interesting. Because yeah, I
very
looked at it quite
interesting.
recently, thinking, I wonder, but naturally it's going to be higher because otherwise you'd have an out of court settlement, and so
Yeah.
you can't negotiate with someone who's narcissistic,
No.
or so naturally you're going to have a higher percentage coming. I mean, that court guide is available on my website in the resources section. I've got a resources section on there, and it is available on there. So you can download it from there. And one of the top tips I have for any litigants in person, and I found this incredibly helpful at the beginning of my career, when I'll be honest, I hated going into court myself. Now it's normal, but at the very start, I hated it. was to do a position statement. So a lot of people don't know that before your hearing, under the family procedure rules, you can do a position statement in advance, and it's to be filed at 11 o'clock the day before. And you can file that with the court outlining what your position is going into that hearing. Now, if you do a really comprehensive, not just comprehensive doesn't mean long, it just
Yeah.
means like really what you want in that position statement, you'll find you don't have to say as much, or you can just rely on the position statement and say, and if they haven't seen it before you go in, because sometimes you'll get a court where the admin's not so good. So you can take a hard copy and say, I've written down my position statement, and you can either read it out or you can hand it to the magistrates or judge, but it really reduces what you have to say, and it can act as that sort of buffer. When you're asked questions, you can refer to it. And I think a lot of people don't know you can file those before. I used to love them because I'd be like, right, I want my position clear before I go in. So you're going into court and you know that court knows where you stand before you even speak, and it can be feel a bit more in control of the hearing.
Yeah, I love that. And thank you for that piece of advice because it is so important for people. I think, again, if they don't know that you can do that, because you may be going in there feeling, oh my God. And the problem is as well, victims and survivors, there's so much that they want to say. And unfortunately, a lot of it isn't relevant to a judge or a
Yeah.
magistrate. They'll just go, okay, fine, that's your experience.
Yeah.
However, we're not interested in that. What we're interested in is what's your position. And like you say, giving
Yeah.
that advice and being able to say, you can do that before you go. And even
Mhm.
if, and I love the fact you're so realistic. How many times, like I love admin can be, depending on where you are. And it's true. Someone can turn up thinking it's all in hand and all dealt with. You could have a
Yeah.
change of judge or magistrate at the last minute. It
Yeah.
could be that you thought you were going to be up in front of a legal advisor and actually, no, you're not. You're up in front of a judge. Things change on the day and at the moment.
Yeah.
And if you have as much information as you say with you that you can, in terms of, doesn't have to be massively long. It's just, what's your
Mhm.
position? What do
Yeah.
envisage, that kind of, and then you have it with you, and it's, yeah, the things like that. That's what's the important advice for people, because I think the problem is dealing with so much is that's all clouding in their heads, and they're trying to deal with 10,000 things, and it's
Oh
just
yeah.
too, yeah, it's too much. So having that in front of them to go, okay, here it is, then yeah, that's a brilliant piece of advice. I love that. I love that.
Yeah, I think it's really helpful. It's one of the things I do, and I say in my pro bonos when people come to me, if they're like a litigant in person, I quite often can't run the entire case pro bono because, well, I think I wouldn't have any like time to do all
Yeah,
of the cases I have.
you've
But I
got to
often
sleep at
give pro
some
bono.
point.
Yeah, I
You've got to
gotta sleep
sleep.
somewhere. So yeah, I give often a lot of pro bono advice, and the other thing I'll do is check statements with people, and I'll say to them like, I've done them before for people pro bono. I've said to them, look, I said, let's just get together the day before, night before, couple of nights before, get a position statement drafted and send it in. And then that's all they need sometimes is what, like an hour of my time to
Yeah.
formulate that position statement and send it to the court. And then they go in feeling a bit more like, oh, okay, like someone's looked at it, it looks reasonable. And it's sort of, I'm taking out a lot of the emotion from it, but I'm putting together like a clear, concise, this report says this, and this is my position on it, and it's very clear. And I tend to find that that's how my pro bono advice is best spent, rather than sort of giving advice on or representing an entire case, which I won't have time for. But same with non-mol statements, people will often send me a non-molestation order statement and say, what do you think of this? Is this okay? And I'll go through and I'll sort of highlight bits that might need to change, or thoughts that they might want to have, or if they've mentioned police in there, or sort of flag like this statement will be served on perpetrator, so are you sure you want to mention police at this stage, or is that going to put them on notice, and all these different things which you pick up on. So yeah, my pro bono isn't just advice. I also give sort of feedback on statements and help them draft it if they need it as well. And that position statement one, I'm not going to say it's an easy thing to do, because it's not, but it's such a good way of putting your position before the court, and it limits what you verbally have to say, so
Yeah,
it can be really
definitely.
helpful.
Yeah, no, I couldn't agree more. And I love the fact you're touching on things like, in terms of taking the emotion out of it. I think that's, for me personally, I think that's one of the biggest steps for somebody and that's the first step in terms of taking back control. So unfortunately, when you're putting a lot of emotion into your statements or your position or whatever, that you're dealing with the court, um, and even just dealing with the perpetrator, whether it's emails, text messages, take that emotion out of it. If you're talking
Mm-hmm.
about, say, you have 2, 3 children, whatever, say the children rather than our children, because
Yeah.
that way, and it sounds, I know to some people it was like, God, that's so cold, but actually it's protecting you. and you are making sure that there's no emotion in it, because the second a perpetrator senses that you're showing a little bit of emotion, they think, oh, I've got them again, and I'll reel them in, and they'll take it all in. Whereas actually, if it's treated very much like, right, we need to deal with this, but I'm going to be very matter of fact about it, there isn't any emotion, then you've cut that emotion off. And a lot of the time it scares them, because they're kind of like, well, I'm not used to this. I'm used to getting what I want. I'm used to being able to wind that person up and get the reaction I was looking for. But you're right, those pieces of advice that are so important, massively important. You're incredible. You are. You do so much.
I'm tired.
Yeah, well, yeah. We need to make the day longer just so you can get everything done. It's crazy, but I do think, it's what you're doing is, you're fighting against the tide of something that's been going on for so long, and you're doing such an incredible job, and not just in your local area. I mean, I'm in Manchester, you're miles away, and actually I see what you're doing, and I can then implement that when I'm talking to people, say, have you heard of this person before? And that's how we do it. And that, in some ways, as much as social media can be, a not very nice place, when we use it for good, and when we use it for these sorts of purposes, you're helping people, across the board, and that's how it should be. Because I often think, especially when it comes to things like the podcast, I think, what if somebody doesn't have access to support in their area? Because going back to funding again, we know a lot of funding gets cut. We know that people don't necessarily have local support in their area. So what do you do then? So being able to access things like this from you, and you could be in the middle of wherever, but knowing that that's advice that they maybe are craving and need, and don't know where to look, and are confused and stressed and worried, but can come here and find it. And that's, to me, is what makes this so special, being able to do this with people like you who 100% get it. And me and you could talk all day. I know we could.
Yeah, I know.
I know. Oh, yeah, and another thing.
Yeah, and this. Yeah.
But you're changing that landscape, and you're changing how, and this is how we need to think of it, I think, is we're turning it on the perpetrator now, going, oh no, actually, this person does have the information, and they know how to get support, and they know what they need to do. And it takes time, doesn't it? And I often think it depends on the individual. I'm sure you see this in your pro bono clinic. Sometimes people don't like what they've heard, and it worries them and stresses them, but actually they may come back a bit later and say, okay, I've got my head around the idea now. Timing's everything, isn't it? You've got to be in that headspace to be able to take that information in, I think.
Yeah, and that can be really, that I would say that is the hardest part of my job, sometimes delivering advice, which I know is painful to hear, and it is hard, because I see it, and I see so clearly what has happened, but my advice is not necessarily what fits their narrative. And it's not because I don't see it and don't understand it, it's because I've seen these cases time and time again. I've seen what happens, and I know that report equals this outcome. So that is possibly the hardest part. Well, it is the hardest part of my job. And then I would say the other thing is watching those decisions be made, like watching the decisions of transfers of residency be made to an unsafe parent. That's incredibly difficult. And I don't think, and just feeling like there's nothing else left that I can do, as that can be really hard, because you feel like, what can you do? Like you put everything forward, and that's just where you land. And it can be exceptionally difficult. I would say that I am seeing I don't want it to end on a complete downer.
No, we won't end on a downer.
I'm seeing a more positive response. To be fair, I am seeing some really positive reports coming in from people like social workers and other agencies, which are really starting to understand, and we're seeing sort of the changes in CAFCAS guidance about how we should consider domestic abuse before looking at alienating tactics. And I think things like messages like that are really, really powerful and really helpful. It's just going through that journey to get there, and I hope that when I'm sort of old and retired, if I ever retire, I will start to see that change that we've been working so hard for now, and we'll start to see it, and by then I'll look back and think, it changed. That's brilliant, because I'm sure we're different now than we were 30 years ago. But it's slow, it's steady, but it is changing.
It is definitely, and eventually, when you're giving that advice, if exactly what you've just said, in terms of if all those agencies, if everything hopefully over time starts to change, starts to evolve, starts to develop, and move forward, then those conversations you will have will become easier, because you won't be having to say, well, this is what you can expect, because actually things are changing. So we know that there's hope there. And I always try and be hopeful in the podcast. We have to be realistic, we have to be honest. And I think people appreciate that, but also it's making them feel seen and heard and validated, and giving them hope. And you give so many people so much hope. You give hope when I see you, because you're so smiley and lovely.
Well, thank you.
Oh, you're amazing. Thank you so much. And I think maybe we need to do in maybe another 6 months, year, whatever, we'll do an update and see where we're at.
Yeah.
That'd be nice, wouldn't it? We should do that.
That would be, yeah. And I think you're amazing too. You keep saying it to me, but I'm going to say that.
Well, I'm a woman. You're amazing. Oh, you're fabulous. Oh, Catherine, I can't thank you enough. And thank you for taking the time, because I'm sure you've just missed your lunch break by doing this, but thank you so much.
Oh, what a lunch break. What's that?
Yeah, what's that? Yeah,
Thanks
eating
for
while
that.
doing it. Thank you. Thank you so much.